Just over 50 years ago, the place which I'm standing used to be a field. Now it's the place where a vibrant community gathers to worship Jesus together. The story is one which includes so many people faithfully serving God. But it began with a small group of people serving with vision, perseverance and hard work. And two of those people who began that journey are Douglas and Betty Kahn.
In 1961, which was 2 years after we had moved to Cheam, my father began to realise that the notice on the field just 200 yards from where we lived, which said that a church would sometime be built there, was really relevant to us as a family. At the time we went to St Lawrence Morden, which was 4.5 miles away, and he thought how much better it would be if we could go to church locally. And my sister and I, who were 15 and 13, could be involved in local youth work.
Margaret and Ken Hobbs have travelled up and down the country to talk to people, to explore the journey of St Paul's. And so Ken takes up the story.
We are on our way to visit the Reverend John Watson, the very first vicar of St Paul's. He arrived at the scene in 1962 with some trepidation.
I'd been a curate for 2 or 3 years and minding my own business in Egham in Surrey. And I had a phone call one day from George Reindorf, who was a powerful and purposeful individual. And he told me about a plot of land being left by a wealthy archdeacon in the late 1920s. And he asked if I'd like to go and build a church there. And of course I should hasten to say that I don't build churches. I'm an ordained minister and an operator. The people who really did it were some senior worshippers from St Lawrence Morden.
Well, when we were still all at church at Morden, that was Douglas and Betty and the Collinses and us, Norman and I. I can remember one Sunday going back to the car, Douglas saying, could we possibly come to his house to meet for prayer? Because for months and months he'd been looking at a piece of land that he knew belonged to the church. And he had increasingly been feeling that we ought to be doing something about putting a church on there.
And the first people I met with were Douglas and Betty Kahn, who lived very near the site of the church. And you could plainly see how enthusiastic they were for the building of a church.
We met, month after month to pray. And gradually the door opened. I think the bishop, you'll probably remember, said that yes, there was a possibility we could have a church there.
And then there was Marcus and Madge Collins and Norman and Pat Bedford, and they provided a tremendous lay nucleus. And so I was just the clerical part of it, but they were really the people.
Marcus was a church was a lay reader. Was a lay reader, that's right. And my husband was also a lay reader. So in a sense, there were people around who would be able to help. But very soon, once plans got going, we were praying for an incumbent.
And this was really a leap of faith, because nobody knew quite how it was going to work out. So I suppose I was a bit frightened, if I could remember that, but very excited as well. And I was quite young still, and so I suppose I was bold enough to have a go.
One of the first things I really remember was the house meetings that we had. And it was so wonderful to have about 50 people all crammed into one room. And that was because of John and June Watson, who'd stepped out in faith to come to How Hill with 2 young children, 4 and 2, and not having a home to live in at that time, and not knowing what the church was ever going to be like.
I can remember when we started to meet in people's houses. It was an area where there were several really quite large houses, so it wasn't a problem until the numbers got so big that we were squashed in. And I can remember on one occasion when we got to the creed, everybody turned in one direction, as we did in those days. And as we started the creed, I looked up and I saw that John Watson, who was by then our vicar, had got his face right up against the wall.
Everything was tremendously informal, and there was I in my extremely formal clothes, and the nearest worshipper was about 2 feet away, and it seemed a little bit strange, dearly beloved brethren and all that, to go through all that formal stuff, which we did.
And as a result, we stopped meeting in houses and managed to get the terrapin.
And we brought in a terrapin hut from London at 4.5 miles an hour in this very heavy snow, and we had a very exciting time sort of painting that up and getting that going. But of course the really important thing is the church is people, and the church was the people, like Douglas and Betty and Madge and Marcus and Pat and Norman, and each had their different gifts.
My lasting memory is that in the Terrapin service, it was on Easter Sunday that it started, which was so wonderful and so apt.
And Pat ran the Sunday school, and so the team grew.
I did start the Sunday school, yes. That wasn't too difficult because there were a lot of children already in the congregation, and it was felt that they needed to be occupied.
Well, the challenge initially came from the bishop to build a church. He wanted it traditional Anglican. We didn't quite want that. But I think the challenge to me really was to build a fellowship in a very privileged part of Surrey.
Well, there was a tremendous fellowship in the early days that you didn't appreciate until, for one reason or another, you left St Paul's.
And we were greatly blessed by the financial generosity of so many, so that within a year, the church and kitchen and coffee bar and car park were all built and paid for.
And then in the end we had the dedication of the church, and to see this cedarwood church there was, well, quite miraculous.
Without a great sense of the presence of God and His showing us the way, it could never have come about.
In 1967, Derek Head succeeded John Watson as vicar of this church. Over a short period of time, the church had become very successful, and for Derek, this had its own particular challenges.
So when I arrived at St Paul's, I discovered what I knew, that there was a strong team, both spiritually. There was a team of 7 readers. Already the children's work was abounding. They knew what the gospel was about. They were able to develop a strategy. They prayed. They were more than optimistic. They had vision. So that was, and the people who were running the administration of the church were also experienced, able in the world. Disproportionately, we had 6 accountants on the PCC.
Derek soon became concerned about the dangers of a successful church. It was also a time when the charismatic movement had just started.
Right from the very beginning, I'd felt that a danger of a successful church, and it had to be called successful, a successful church becoming actually very self-centred and very enclosed. And I used to say that my job is to stand at the door and make sure that the doors are open in order that people can come in, and not just people who were clubby people or people with crusader badges. I'd had a crusader badge, but I didn't want to be, the gospel isn't limited, it's universal, it's God's invitation, God's wide invitation. I felt that the church needed to relate to other churches in the neighbourhood. I tried to participate in the deanery things. I was chairman of the Deanery Association for Social Work, which was providing homes for unmarried mothers. Now that was not exactly part of the evangelical agenda. Perhaps it may have been, but and this also was when we got into contentious issues around the charismatic later on. I think I perceived the charismatic movement as potentially damaging and dividing, and I was concerned about keeping the thing together. I think that the people who succeeded me were able to help us over that, help St Paul's over that hump and make the charismatic an enrichment and part of the development of its life.
Each minister left their own mark on St Paul's. Richard Spearin, who followed Derek Head, led the church to a very definite evangelical position.
Well, I had the bishop's permission to do so, really, because that was the sort of parish I'd asked for when I arrived back in England from Kenya. And that was the parish I was given, so I had carte blanche from the bishop to be an evangelical vicar.
Another feature of Richard's time at St Paul's was the introduction of shared leadership.
Shared leadership was very important because it was difficult for me as a new vicar to get control of this very lively church. I had 6 lay readers to look after, so I had to organise the preaching very carefully, and there were 16 house groups. How to control this wagon load of monkeys. So I needed more leadership. As a lonely vicar, I couldn't look after the whole thing myself.
Richard Spearin's wife, Pat, realised that St Paul's was failing in its ministry to the elderly, and so she started Tea Club. And from Tea Club, all this began.
One of the first things I did was to start a tea club. And the tea club was held in a little room at the back of the old St Paul's, and we managed to beg and borrow and steal some sofas, and we met. And so some of the very holy people at St Paul's said, "Who are you going to have as speakers?" And I said, "I don't want any speakers. We're just going to sit and chat and have cups of tea." And that was how the tea club started, and it ministered to those people both in the church and people who came from outside the church. And then linked with that, I also started a lunch club because some of those folk were finding it difficult to go on cooking meals, and they appreciated having a nice hot meal.
And so from Tea Club came Lunch Club, and then Midweek Focus, attended every week by more than 60 people.
The other thing that I started, probably about 1978, was Conquest, Art for the Physically Handicapped.
We do thank God that during my time there, the church grew quite a lot. I'd picked up all sorts of tips on how to make a church grow from my experience with revival movements in different parts of the world.
The church building then was only meant to be temporary. The congregation continued to grow. There were twice as many children and adults on the site than the church building could accommodate. That was the challenge the next vicar, Andrew Thomas, had to face.
I think before I actually appeared in Cheam, thoughts were already being given to what to do about the lack of space in St Paul's Church. Lovely building though it was, and it was the first building that was on that site apart from the terrapin hut that was there before. So there'd been a lovely sort of history of movement from the homes in the parish to the terrapin to the first church, which wasn't a very substantial building, and I don't think it was ever built to last a lifetime. And we needed more space. More and more people seemed to be coming. So we began with the experiment of trying to involve all ages in worship by having us meeting separately in the church and in the Norday Hall. And when the whistle went at half-time, as it were, all the children would come out of one door and go through into the halls, and all the adults would pack into the church. So for quite a time we experimented, and it worked well, and we saw that's what we really wanted to do, to have a big enough building where all ages could worship and enjoy being together. Then a group called the Project Council was brought together, and to cut a long story short, and Douglas Calm was very much the architect behind this, Catching the Tide was put round the whole congregation. So we, as I say, we consulted the whole church family, and I remember this meeting in St Paul's one Sunday night, and we had a gift chest in the middle of the church. We invited people to come forward with their pledges, and in they all went, and it was very exciting. And I think I'm right in saying we amassed about 700,000. We opened the church on that glorious day in '89, wasn't it? And that was the consecration service. And I think we were debt-free. So great rejoicings that day as the bishop led us around the new church.
In 1995, Steve Wilcoxon came to St Paul's. He came from a medium-sized church in Chester to find a very large church, and with that, some adjustments needed to be made.
We knew when we came to St Paul's it was a much bigger church, probably twice the size, so that took some getting used to. But I think the biggest thing really was the area in southwest London, northeast Surrey, is much more blessed with Christians than other parts of the country. We suddenly discovered we had a Christian dentist and a Christian doctor and even a Christian baker and so forth. And that would have been not thinkable really where we'd lived before. So we suddenly felt that we were in a bit of a Christian bubble, which was quite comfortable, but also it was quite a challenge to think this isn't the real world. It was a great joy to work with people who were beginning to find their own professional life challenged by the call of God into moving their ministry from the professional workplace into some kind of full-time Christian ministry. And so we've tried to talk about St Paul's being a resource to the global church, and one of the things I think St Paul's and churches like it can contribute to the world church is that we can provide globally and nationally leaders that those areas can't raise up quite so readily. So the general flow, a steady flow of ordinands and of people wanting to explore ministry abroad was a great joy to be part of. I think one of the challenges facing us soon after we arrived that I realised was that if we didn't restructure a number of things, we would be on a plateau, and churches on plateaus tend to actually decline in the end. So I felt that we needed to move forward, first of all, to have a much more intentional statement of what our vision as a church was, to look at how we did small groups so that they became the centre of church life, so that everybody had a significant place of belonging, and that especially with increasingly tired professionals and quite stressed people with very busy lives, in order to deliver the ministry that was required, we were going to have to look afresh at staff size, because we had a very small staff when I first arrived. There was myself and Frank McGill and a youth worker who soon in fact left, and a small office staff, but it was a very small staff team, and we were at the point really of needing to move from being a church which had in a sense seen to its own growth from its own strength of lay ability to a church that was serviced by a number of people who had been set aside. So increasing the staff size was going to become quite a challenge. And then the other thing, of course, was that the church had talked for quite a while about church planting and had never quite found the right formula. And we spent a few years looking at that as to what would be the right way of going about it. And so I felt that unless St Paul's learned, in a sense, to export a congregation, it didn't deserve to grow any bigger than it was.
The vision of church planting came to fruition when Steve heard about the plans to close down St Mary's Burr Heath.
There was a story in the local press about the plan to close down this church in another parish in the deanery. And the furore that was kicking up amongst the local people. The parish in which it sat couldn't really afford to keep it going. The congregation was ageing and very small and couldn't sustain the life of the church. So we were left with a landmark building, a community that didn't want to lose it, no congregation to run it, and nobody really able to figure out how this could be rescued. Well, we had several small groups meeting in the general Banstead area. And so I made the offer to the diocese that we could actually rescue the church and do something about planting a congregation there. We planted into the church, I think it was 45 or 50 people. We had to do a lot of work on the building. People coming to St Mary's now can't imagine how dark and cold and damp it was, and how inaccessible through the very inadequate approachway, and there was no car parking space and so on. So the money that went into that was very considerable. So it was just a nice story really over a number of years of God opening doors and a congregation finding a place to worship and a community being reached that otherwise would have not had a church.
So here we are, 50 years later, looking back, celebrating all that God has done in this place, in and through the people. And as we celebrate and rejoice in God's love, we listen to Psalm 78 and verse 4, where we read, "We will tell the next generation the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord, his power and the wonders he has done." And so we shall, as we continue on the journey, living out God's love and seeking to serve the people in this community and across the world.